All right, so I wanted to look at the story of Malchus. Malchus and the servant of the high priest who had his ear cut off. And it's quite the story. I mean, there is a lot of different avenues to go with in this story, and we'll touch on a few, and um, and we'll kind of go down some alleyways with some of the ideas in the story, but it's quite profound. So, um, what I thought I would do would be to just introduce some of these ideas and then um, allow you to have a discussion with yourself on some of these ideas. But the story itself is in the Gospels, of course, each giving a different um, layer of detail to the story. But we will look at the Luke account, and then we'll put it together with the account of John and perhaps Mark. And so what you have here is the Garden of Gethsemane. And so you already have this picture of it's actually very Eden-like in a sense that everything started with a garden. It started in the Garden of Eden, and now we are in this different garden. It's the Garden of Gethsemane. And here we have Christ in his final moments and his moments of difficulty, his moments of pain, and his moments of acceptance of what is to come. And so, picking up in Luke chapter 22, verse 49, and it says, "Those around Jesus saw what was about to happen and said, 'Lord, should we strike with swords?' And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear." And so it's interesting. Um, there is this question of, the question comes and it's, shall we strike? And before there could even be an answer, one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. And perhaps it's significant to look at why it's the right ear, but nonetheless, we have to identify who was that did this. And if you go to the account of John, it gives us who that was. And it says, "Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus." Okay, so there's a story. And then it says, furthermore in Luke, "But Jesus answered, 'No more of this.' And he touched the man's ear and healed him." And so you can imagine that perhaps the ear came off and it was on the ground, um, or perhaps it was still attached somehow, and he put it back together. Nevertheless, it's interesting to think about Peter being the one to do this and acting very impulsively, right? And then there's two kinds of people. Well, seemingly, there's two kinds of people: those who ask for permission to do something, and those who just do without being asked. And both have its positives and negatives, right? It's not necessarily an observation of which one was correct, and sometimes we can make conclusions on which one is the correct at any given moment, right? Perhaps someone like Peter seems like the type of individual to take initiative and do something without being told. And again, that has its consequences. Perhaps there is a lot of room for error and a lot of room for impulsivity. And then there is the individuals who ask for permission before they do something, and something could be said about those individuals in the sense that, you know, well, clearly they're not taking the initiative. But again, on a case by case scenario, because in this case, well, it would have been great for Peter to have the answer, wait for the answer instead of acting upon his impulses. And so, it's not very black and white. It's nuanced as far as these approaches. But Regardless, I wanted to take a deeper dive into some of the reasons why his ear might have been healed. And so I, there's a couple reasons that I think the ear was healed. Actually, I think there's a multitude of reasons, but I want to highlight just a few. So the first obvious one that strikes is the fact that this is the high priest that is convicting him. This is the high priest servant, which means if he's a servant, he's not only been with the high priest for a long time, but he probably will be with him for a very long time to come. And what a reminder daily of the fact that the one that they crucified was clearly and throughout the story, like following the story throughout the story, he is the Messiah because, well, he performs a miracle, he heals the individual, and there's a level of compassion there, a level of empathy. um, Christ understands that through violence not much is going to be achieved, and that violence actually becomes a barrier to the real higher goals and purposes. But you know, for this high priest, the same one that is looking to convict him, every day there would be a reminder of what had taken place, and so you can imagine that there's some sort of cognitive dissonance that takes place. Caiaphas, having witnessed a miracle that contradicted his actions and beliefs, persecuting Jesus, is now in this position in which he has to tell himself, he has to at the daily sight of Malchus' ear that serves as a reminder of this conflict, he has to reconcile his actions with the undeniable evidence of his divine power because he performed this miracle. And it's not just the fact that it was a miracle, but it is the thought behind the miracle, the result of it. It is the like I said, the empathy and compassion and display of the character of Christ. And so, um, the way for Caiaphas to resolve this dissonance would be for him to change his beliefs and accept his mistakes. And there's a lesson for us there too, right? I mean, you know, what stops us? What stops that from happening? And a lot of the times it's pride, right? It's like you witness something that completely speaks against your preconceived ideas, but because having to change your beliefs and live those out would cause changes to your life and would make some disruptions in your life. We live in this state of cognitive dissonance, right? And so you can see from a psychological perspective the need to maintain one's self-image and social status, which is incredibly influential, especially to the high priest. Admitting that he was wrong would threaten his reputation among his peers, and that's interesting, right? To think about, to the regard that how often, especially today in society, we have this kind of crisis, if you will, in which there is evidence that's being presented that contradicts the beliefs that are being held by individuals, but yet, in order to maintain status and position, one takes the position of living in a state of dissonance. And so, there you have it. That's one of the powerful things about this act, right? And you can imagine that Malchus, I mean, he is perhaps, I would imagine, unless he also goes into that state of cognitive dissonance to be able to also protect his position as a servant, he might be more inclined to give up his position, given that it's a more lowly position as a servant. But he may be more inclined given what he has seen to be true. And this can be seen about um, much in those who hold high positions. It is very unlikely that they will admit their mistake. because of what it means to lose that position. So I thought that was interesting, right? And so now you have Peter. He was aiming for the head, and he got a year. And okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. Um, so here's another layer of information to ponder upon. Peter, at the, what would you say, at his attack, and what he and the violence that he perpetrated, he would have been at risk of himself being executed for the crime that he had committed, or at least be thrown into jail for a very long time. Now, what would that have meant for Peter's long-term trajectory, right? Like, um, had Christ not had mercy on Malchus and on Peter, Peter would possibly have served a long sentence, and he would have never been this pillar that is often looked at, you know. And so, in order to, and it's interesting because, in a sense, again, it almost foreshadows what is about to happen, if you will, because Peter should receive the punishment for what he did, but because of the mercy of Christ, he does not receive the punishment that is owed to him. And so that's a foreshadow of the cross moment in and of itself. This is what is deserved, but it is the sentence that you deserve is a sentence that you will not receive. You will not receive the sentence. And so it's almost a foreshadow of that. And so, that the action of healing the ear itself, um, speaks to, as I mentioned, the moment that is to come. But to us, it's this idea of mercy and wiping the slate clean. I mean, there was no evidence of Peter's crime, which is interesting to think about. I mean, it certainly begs the question of whether we as individuals should be applying that certain level of mercy to other individuals. And you know it's something to think about, for sure. Do we, in times where individuals acted impulsively, thinking that they were doing the right thing but have done great harm, do we, in recognizing that, do we give them a second chance, a second opportunity, without condemning them to the just due punishment? It's a tough question. It's a tough position, but it's something to definitely think about. And so, there's those two reasons, right? And you think about why the year, and the symbolism of the year, perhaps, and what it represents for listening, understanding, and communication. Um, but it also, I think, speaks to one more thing that I wanted to mention as a kind of final piece of discussion, which the discussion can continue within your own mind. But so there is this so okay, so let's go back to the scripture. And if you go to John, in the book of John, after that situation, when he tells Peter, put your sword away, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? And so that's a radical acceptance. From a psychological perspective, it's radical acceptance of the of the path that has been laid out, of the cards that have been dealt, of the decision that has been made. Jesus has his radical acceptance, and he says, your positioning, the actions that you're taking are to stop the radical acceptance that I have already ventured into in drinking the cup of suffering. And it's interesting, the cup of suffering. And, maybe a question to ask ourselves is, are we metaphorically, are we swinging swords in order to stop ourselves from consuming the cup of suffering? And is it from a denial of not willing to accept what is to come and not willing to accept the suffering that must take place that we do that? And in essence, we disrupt the plan that is orchestrated from above. So those are three things to think about, right? So you have the healing for the purpose of a daily reminder to exemplify, and again, we don't know if Caiaphas had a conversion per se, but I think it does paint I think it paints portraits of people in society, which, though presented with the right evidence, the possible loss of status and position leaves this individual to continue to be in a state of cognitive dissonance, though there is a daily reminder of the fact that they are wrong. And so that's the embodiment of pride. And then you have the second positioning, which is this act of mercy to cover the slate clean of something that an individual deserves technically, but in order to have some nuance of understanding, instead of looking at it from a very black and white perspective, to be able to provide a certain level of mercy. And then lastly, what swords are being drawn in order to prevent the radical acceptance of the suffering that we must embark on. And maybe it would be worthy to think about these swords as maybe our hedonistic pursuits, the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of pleasure. So those are some ideas from the Malchus story.